Hello, my name is Michael Tucker. I'm a Senior Product Solution Specialist with Medidata. I want to thank you today for joining me for the session on looking beyond the current trends in virtual trials. As we look around us in this pandemic era, I'm sitting here in my house in Austin, Texas. You're sitting in your home, wherever it might be. We see that the world is changing, but we also know that the world is always changing, isn't it? So we have to ask ourselves, what in the world is changing for clinical trials? If we look across the past several hundred years, we see a history of the modern day clinical trial forming starting in 1787. The last 230 years have been some significant events that have created what we would consider today to be our scientific method for conducting clinical trials. And for about 200 years, we've done everything about the same. It was only about 1947 or so that we started introducing principles about patient centricity and focusing in on the patient being the key to the success of a clinical trial. And it's only been in the past 20 years or so that we've seen this significant change in the way that we capture data for clinical trials, starting with EDCs and ECOA, e-consent, and this movement towards virtualization or decentralization of clinical trials. And now we're starting to see more and more use of clinical grade sensors and ways to collect data points from patients in a passive way as well. So what's changed in the world around us? Over the past 20, 30 years or so, we've seen this significant change in the way that we get information. Patients have become more aware of their conditions. They've become more aware of the way that their bodies work and the disease processes. They've learned through the news that now is 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. It's always on. Patients have also become more social. As human beings, we've always been a social creature, but now with the advent of technology, we have ways of reaching out like we never have before. Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, Reddit, and other tools that allow us to interact with other people and share information and insights and perhaps talk about our disease processes or talk about our concerns, even while we're participating in a clinical trial. Patients have also become more informed, not just aware of the world around them, but informed about their clinical issues or their disease processes. So they are able to go out and access more information today than ever before, going to places like WebMD and PubMed and the medical journals that are out there that allow them to read up and study about what are the current trends going on in medicine. So what in the world has changed to get them to this point? Well, as we look at the increase in population in the world, we see that today there are almost 8 billion people on this planet and growing on a daily basis. We also see that in the past 10 or 15 years, access to information has been increased by the use of the technologies around us. The active internet users are now more than 50% of the population of the world, actually 59% as of last month. We see that there are over 50% of people in the world who are active, unique mobile internet users. They have cell phones. They have ways of accessing information from wherever they are as they travel around. We see this internet usage growing, especially in countries like United Kingdom, South Korea, United States, many others where a high percentage of the population has access to the internet. And even in other world areas that are continuing to grow, like India and China, getting access to the internet is much more common to most people within those countries and will continue to grow. And same thing with mobile usage. We see that in some countries, we see a high percentage of the population having more than one mobile device, having two cell phones or a cell phone and a tablet, but different ways that we have of connecting to the internet wherever we might be. And the whole idea of technology delivery, people are becoming more trusting in the scalability, the global infrastructures that we put in place for accessing information and sharing information, making sure that there are security and disaster recovery programs in place for databases and different systems that are being used for tracking information. Having interconnected web-based and native apps, it's becoming easier for us these days to be able to share information in multiple ways, so not just on an app, but through a web browser perhaps, and share that same data into the same type of database. Regulatory frameworks are changing as well. Regulators are taking more of a risk-based approach in looking at how they're going to control the data or allow us to manage data on clinical trials. And the move towards a global data privacy regulations that are in place that help protect patient information, help protect individuals and their information as they share it on the internet and other places. And then this whole drive towards patient centricity, the idea that the patient should be a partner with us in clinical research, that a patient's voice should be heard in every way that we design studies and we conduct clinical trials. So a lot has changed in the world, and today patients are more aware. They're technology driven and they're informed, and they are now taking that and investing their time in learning about diseases and drugs and devices and the locations where they can go to participate in a clinical trial, and even results from similar trials. So they're starting to compare what the results should be and understand what they might expect from participating in a clinical trial. So today we have better educated patients than ever before in the history of mankind. We also see this significant change from this pandemic that we're going through right now. The strategies that have been put in place to help support clinical trials during this time, and this heightened awareness of change that we've seen throughout the industry, both sponsors and CROs seeking options for how do we reach our patients, how do we continue to provide the safety and maintain the data integrity on our clinical trials during this pandemic era. And this heightened discussion by regulators and industry between the two, between regulators and industry participants, in understanding what needs to occur and what types of governance and guidance documents should be put in place to allow us as an industry to continue to serve the patients on our clinical trials and continue to conduct the important research that you do on a daily basis. We see this through this rapid global regulatory response. We've been tracking this throughout the pandemic and continue to see new regulator guidance documents that are coming out. Some of these are named here on the screen here in the United States, in Canada, in Europe, in England, across the Asian countries, and you can go out and look at each of these guidance documents, but they all address some of the same core principles. How do we engage patients more effectively, ensure patient safety, and guarantee data integrity during the conduct of clinical trials during COVID-19? So one of the big areas that we've seen a change in as well is this whole definition of source. Where do we capture data from? Historically, we've captured data from the point of an investigator interacting with a patient at a trial site. A patient comes in, they're sharing information about their experience, they're looking through a diary, they're taking different types of assessments while the patient is there in the clinic. But as we've seen this increase in the use of technology over the past 20 years, we see this movement away from the site being the place that source takes place, and more towards where the patient might be at any time, whether it's their home or their workplace. But as they're on the move, we talk about those mobile technologies. As they're on the move, being able to share data from wherever they might be. So this whole concept of where source is being collected has changed. And it allows us to create a trial dial that allows us to determine what level of decentralization or virtualization is needed for a particular trial, and being able to look at a protocol and determine whether or not we can reduce or eliminate some of the site visits or some of the assessments that are taking place, because now we can conduct them in a different way. So this is constantly evolving and changing, and our patients have an expectation that as an industry, we'll keep up with the rest of the world. They are used to using their smartphones for accessing their banking, accessing their information about their sports teams or the news or whatever it might be. They have in their palm of their hands the ability to learn about the world and share and interact with the world around them. Why not in the clinical trial setting as well? What we have seen are traditional clinical trials have challenges that continue to grow as patients become more impatient with the way that we've traditionally managed these clinical trials. We see that about 23% or a quarter of our population are dissatisfied with the location of sites, where the sites are taking place, or where they have to go and visit. It may be too far away from their work. It may be in another town or another city, and it's inconvenient for them to get to that site. About 58%, we've seen an increase in the number of investigative sites due to increased trial complexity. We also see that trials are being canceled due to insufficient participation. We can't get enough patients to join a clinical trial for some of the same reasons. It's too difficult to get to a trial center. They don't understand the information about the trial itself. But about 30% of the trials are canceled due to insufficient participation. And we see another 30% of patients dropping out of clinical trials. One of the figures that's not on the screen for you is that about 35% of patients that decided not to join the clinical trial said they didn't join because it was too difficult to understand the informed consent process. So even just simplifying that process or giving them tools that allow them to learn about the clinical trial and go through the consent process through e-consent or remote consent can increase that number of patients that decide to join a study because they have a better understanding. We see that about 80% of sites fail to enroll to the targets. And also there's an 80% drop in new patients that have entered clinical trials at the peak of COVID-19. So the significant decrease in patients being involved simply because they can't get to a trial site or they don't feel safe going to a trial site. So I like to think about the patient experience or the patient journey and think of what the patient goes through on a clinical trial, looking at how do they find the clinical trial? How do they learn about the study? What process do they go through to consent on the study and decide whether or not they want to join the study? Being randomized and starting to share their data through ePro, eCOA type tools, having their site visits, and whether those are in person or remote, there's some way for them to interact with the clinical staff. And then this whole idea of digital endpoints, being able to capture data passively from a patient through sensors and different types of wearable devices. And then at the end of the study, being able to have access to their data and understand what was the trial all about? How did I place in the trial? Was I part of a control group or an active group? And can I get my data back at the end? There's a lot of lab data that was taken. Can I get that back and be able to take that back for standard of care with my clinician after the study is over? So there's this journey that the patients go on, and historically we have fulfilled this journey with different types of tools that the patient interacts with in an application layer. There's typically an EDC that's involved, a data capture tool that is the main source for a repository for the data to be stored in. There are e-consent products that the patients may use to interact and learn about the study and decide to join the study. Tools for randomization like IVR, randomization engines, eCOA for capturing data, wearable sensors for bringing in the digital endpoints. And this is historically over the past 10 to 15 years been the way that we've conducted clinical trials. What we're seeing now is this change in the environment also, where patients are expecting not just to participate in clinical trial by utilizing electronic tools, but by using their own devices. And to do that, we have to come to a true BYOD environment. And the best way to do that is to bring in a browser layer that allows us to share information from any device, from a smartphone, a tablet, a PC, a laptop, wherever it might be, and be able to extend some of these tools out and include tools like telehealth or live video visits, where we can interact with the patient at the trial site, with the clinician and patient together remotely being able to share information and talk about the clinical trial and the concerns and go over their e-consent or the consent forms, and maybe do full visits electronically or remotely. So the whole idea of adding a browser layer in allows us to give that capability for a patient to use any device anywhere to be able to participate in that clinical trial. They don't have to have a prescribed device that you've supplied them to be able to join and participate in that trial. So where is this heading? Well, we see that as we start collecting all of this data from patients and start having them explore and participate in the clinical trial through these different modalities, whether it's an application layer or a browser layer. But we start to see abilities for us to capture more data and to be able to do things like give patients their data back at the end of a clinical trial or even during a clinical trial. Why not give them their lab data that they can continue standard of care with their clinician during the trial as well? And that leads to the idea of having patient registries that are built into a single unified platform where patients can be recruited for clinical trials in the future as well. And you can see where I'm going with this. As we start to work with patients and start to capture data from them and ask them to share more information, we start to build this rich database of a patient's phenotypic and genotypic profile that allows us to identify those patients who might be the right patients to participate in one of our clinical trials. So as we look to external sources like EMR and EHR data to share both inward and outward from our clinical trial, we start to enrich that data even more, because now we have access to baseline information that may be years old that we can look at for a patient and be able to identify how long a disease process may have been occurring based on lab results or based on observational results throughout the years, but also be able to return that data to a patient's EMR or EHR out of our clinical databases that allows that patient to continue that standard of care during and after the clinical trial is over. So why is unification important? As we think about a unified platform and sharing information across one system, it starts with the patient experience. As we think about how to serve our patients better, we have to ask ourselves, how easy is it for the patient to participate in our clinical trials? How easy is it for them to have their own devices and be able to go into one interface to be able to share information that gets stored in a single platform or database? Data integrity is also key. What are the risks of transcription errors or data loss if we start tying together multiple systems instead of having a single unified platform? What about data availability? How easy is it for you to get your data? And I know we've developed some incredible tools over the past 20 or 30 years that allow us to find data and to draw it into warehouses and do a lot of manipulation and changes. But how easy is it for us to do that in today's systems? Is it easier for us to do that out of a unified platform? And then finally, the concept of extension of use, so the data that's being collected. What other ways can the patient or researchers use that data? And understanding that there are ethical challenges there, making sure that we cover the ethical side of getting permission to use their data in the proper way. But how can patients use that data as well? If I'm wearing a device all day long for your clinical trial and it's measuring my heart rate and it's detecting anomalies in my heart, how critical is it for me to have that information to take back to my primary care physician to continue monitoring my heart over time and be able to have that baseline data that was collected on your clinical trial that can continue to serve me for the years ahead? So I'll end with this. As we think about our clinical trials today and this patient journey and the tools that we've built around this, we see this merging of technologies. And I believe that this whole concept of patient portals that we're moving towards beyond just a virtual trial or beyond decentralized clinical trials is going to provide a convergence of the clinical and healthcare data that's needed for us to be able to conduct more of a patient's genotypic and phenotypic review and be able to conduct more personalized medicine, being able to identify a patient perhaps for a clinical trial by their genotype or by computable phenotypes that make them a better candidate for that trial. and be able to identify what is the proper dosage and ways that we can treat that patient on a clinical trial. So it's only through this trusted relationship where we're engaging with the patient and asking them to join in and share their data in a patient portal that we're going to be able to effectively reach those patients who are going to be the best candidates for our clinical trials. I want to thank you today for your time, and we'll have a few minutes for questions and answers after this. So I look forward to joining you in that live session. Thank you and have a great afternoon.